now. And then I also, I put some of my bore oil in the smaller bottle, so I'm not trying to pour it out of the big bottle. I like to put a little bit on the outside and oil things as evenly as possible. And just rub it in. Again, you want to avoid getting it on the pads. Sometimes I see an instrument that some of the resins have actually worked their way out of the wood, and it's got little tiny specks of resin on the surface that are hard, and it feels just really coarse. And I actually will kind of scrape that off with my fingernail and oil things, and it'll improve the appearance and feel of the wood considerably. In extreme cases, I'll even actually use a pipe cleaner with a little bit of oil, not too much. Oil will attract dust and dirt, and I'll oil more thoroughly, again being very careful to avoid the actual tone holes and pads, because you can ruin an expensive pad job quickly. And that looks pretty good there. Let's set the bell aside and do the rest. I do this every couple of months. I believe in keeping the wood back to dimensions. I've actually seen adjustments change. The posts and the keys are attached to the wood, and I've actually seen horns go rather dramatically out of adjustment after oiling. So I like to keep the wood as hydrated and as close to the original dimensions as I can this way. And I'll use a rag to wipe off if I get a little too much on there. It's good to keep a paper towel or rag handy. That makes the wood look a lot better too. You can do a more thorough job if you have the instrument completely apart. I've actually, on a Ray oboe I recently owned, I've noticed that just the tuning, the right hand notes were going sharp on me, and if I kept the wood oiled, the tuning improved a bit. So it really can make a difference in the dimensions of the wood. You see the bell rings and things like that coming loose, that's another indication you might want to do this. Concerning hydrating with like the little snakes, the little water things that people, little green snakes that people fill with water, they have a sponge in them and you put them in your case. If you're in a real dry climate like maybe Arizona, that might be a good thing. Be very careful with that though, anywhere other than the driest of climates, because it can cause a mildew problem that's impossible to get rid of out of the wood or out of the case itself. So I'd be careful about that. And that's the bore oiling. Next we come to key oiling. I use a machinery oil for one of my lathes. It's a little heavier than what they sell as key oil. You want some sort of a mineral oil on the keys. Vegetable oils can actually be a little bit acidic, and you don't want that same oil that you would use on the bore on your keys. Most oils that the music stores sell are too thin. One that I do like is the Yamaha key oil. It's considerably heavier than others. So if you're shopping for key oil, you might get that brand. And once or twice a year, you want to add a little oil to the keys where they meet the posts. And you want one of these little needle oilers so you don't add a whole drop that would run down the post and get on the wood and collect dust and be a mess, and maybe even get all over your key corks, which would make the glue give it up. Key corks would be falling off, that sort of thing. And you just oil each one of those spots everywhere on the horn. To do a slightly more thorough job, you can back out the screw and then turn it back in. You can get a little oil on the end of the screw here. It's not as good as completely taking it apart, but that'll spread the oil a little bit better. It might also give you an indication of how dirty the old oil is, whether things are starting to corrode and stick on you, and it might give you an indication that yes, you do need to take it apart and completely oil it, or hire a repairman to do that for you. And I would just go through and catch each one of those spots like that. I don't generally oil the adjustment screws. You can heat those good with a small torch and heat some oil in if they are stuck. I'll show you that more in a later video showing more advanced stuff. But that's how I would oil the keys, not more than about once or twice a year, because you want to keep all that oil off of there, off the posts and off the pads. That's key oiling. Now we're going to look at removing and cleaning octave vents. I'm going to do just, usually I would do both of these at once. I'm just going to do the bottom one for now. When grabbing these screws, I try to grab them with flat pliers that don't have teeth on it, and I want to grab it in a way that's not going to squeeze the screwdriver slot closed. If you can see the screwdriver slot there, I wouldn't want to grab it in a way that would squeeze that closed, so I'll do it the other direction. When unscrewing these, I try to keep my fingers in such a way that the screwdriver can't slip and scratch things. Again, I'm going to grab it where I'm not going to damage the screw slot. I always observe the pad seat on these. Sometimes I'll take my magnifier, 10 times magnifier, and look at the pad seat, see if it's cracked and needs changing. This one's a little borderline. We might look at that later. And then I've got my adjustable octave vent. Many people sell these. Forest Music's generally where I would get them. I've gone through 2 or 3, breaking them. And you want to get in those. This is a rather precarious way to remove and install something. This would be known as a spanner wrench to a machinist. You want to put it in the holes, adjust it so it fits well, and you want as much downward as turning pressure to keep it in the holes. And it may take quite a bit of pressure to get that out. I've never had this one out. There we go. It's not unusual for those things to slip. You can see the old wax on there as a sealant. There's the vent out. I generally soak the vent in some of my contact cement glue thinner. Any other kind of thinner would do, mineral spirits. Good to have a rag handy for when you spill things. I'm just going to set that aside while I look into this other, into the vent area and clean that up. I'm going to use a small screwdriver to clean up the excess wax. Usually where the problem is not so much in the vent, but down in the hole. There's about maybe a 1/16 of an inch of tone hole through the wood below this. This metal insert here is called the Octave bowl. That screws into the wood with usually a little bit of shellac or super glue. Sometimes the vent and bowl are corroded and the whole thing comes out together. And then you have to use some penetrating oil and heat. I set it on a fire brick and use a torch to heat it up good. And then I can hold it in a vise and pad it with leather so I don't mess up the screw threads on the outside of this bowl here. And I'll use the vent remover. If you really have a hard time getting it out, you can use a punch and a rawhide mallet. And just in one of the holes, hold this punch at an angle and kind of tap it in the direction, counterclockwise direction with a fair amount of pressure. And you can usually get out stuck vents that way. You can heat them up with a little soldering iron and heat some penetrating oil in there. You'd have to be, you couldn't do much of that on a plastic instrument, but you can use a fair amount of heat on wood. Just watch if you see the oil bubbling out of the wood around there, it's definitely time to stop. And then I like to look in the bore. I've got a small light. Things like this are available from the woodwind repair suppliers. I got this one from a neon light company, and I don't remember where. And you look down in there, and you can see the small bore going down to the bore. The small hole. and you want to make sure that that's not dirty, and that's where you usually have your problem. I'll take a toothpick or a sliver of oboe cane and shove it down in there, something that's not going to scratch. It'll be softer than the wood, especially if it's a grenadella. This happens to be a piece of kingwood. I'll turn that around, and then you'll often see inside the bore that something's poked down in there, and you swab that out. And that's the area that's usually dirty. Sometimes I'll use kind of a plastic bristled pipe cleaner and clean out the bowl threads here that the vent fits into. And usually by the time you've done all that, the vent is soaked enough that you can take it out of the solution. I like to do these octave vents one at a time. The lower one actually on an oboe has a slightly larger diameter hole than the upper one, and if you get them mixed up, you'll get a buzz to your sound on the second octave key notes, so you want to avoid mixing those up. I'll clean off any wax here, and I use a small shaving kit brush as necessary to clean that off. It's possible to run a thread through there, a piece of reed thread that you've unraveled, or other thin nylon thread, and clean out the hole itself if you need to. I hold it up to the light and make sure that's clear. Now when you put it back together, it may not be a perfect seal, just the two brass pieces together. So you're going to want to put little beeswax around there. Some people put it on the outside. I put it on the inside lip of the vent. And make up or roll up a little worm of this thing, of this wax. And put it around the underneath lip of that vent. I don't know how well you can see that in the video. And put it back in. Screw it back in. You want to know that you're solidly all the way back in without over tightening it, which would make it more difficult to get out later. And you can see any excess wax squeezes out. And it's nice to see that it comes all the way around. That assures me that there's a good seal there. Wipe off any extra. Some people put just a little dab of wax along one edge. You can put a steel rod in there and hold a torch up to the rod, maybe about here, and the heat will travel down, heat up the vent, and the wax will melt all around it. That way your wax will be more on the outside. Some of my customers don't like the appearance of that wax on the outside of the vent, so I do it this way. Some people feel you really should replace the pad every time you remove the vent because you might not get it exactly to the same orientation. Usually if the pad is in good shape, I'll use the same pad, put it back on there. You can check the suction and make sure it's okay. I'd say probably more like 2/3 of the time I'll replace the pad. I always like to put a little oil on the rods. The threaded part and just here, it'll spread. You don't need oil all the way along the length of the rod. Those are called rods or steels or arbors. Threaded rods. They go by various names depending on who you're talking to. I usually have my fingers in such a way as to guide the screwdriver. It's best whenever you're hooking keys back on if you can possibly get the spring hooked before you get the start threading the rod back in. It'll avoid, if you get the key on first and then try to hook the spring, you're likely to flex the spring too far and possibly weaken the spring. Again, I'll clean that off if it needs it. These look pretty clean. Just a little bit on the end, and it'll spread when you put it in there. Most key oil I see is too thin. This is a machinery oil I use. The best of the key oil you can get from the music stores is the Yamaha brand, I believe. All the others are just too thin. And that's it. I know several professional oboists and oboe teachers who are brave enough to pull apart their instrument, and they will occasionally pull it all apart and to do a more thorough job of cleaning and oiling. And I believe, depending on your climate where you live and work, that it should be done every few years. I would recommend every 5 years, more often in humid climates or very dusty climates. I'm not going to pull this completely apart, but I'm going to get a good start here. I forgot my pliers. You're going to want a pair of smooth jaw pliers that won't do damage. When pulling out these rods, it's best to grab them in a way that will not squeeze the screwdriver slot closed, especially if the rod's a little stuck and it takes you a little pressure to get it out. You want to be able to pull it out in a manner that where you're squeezing it so that you're going opposite the screwdriver slot. And then when you have it out, that looks real clean. Sometimes it's real black with dirt. You can wipe that off. If you wanted to, you could take a pipe cleaner if it were particularly dirty. I don't do this all the time, but on really dirty ones, and clean out the hinge tubing. I blow it out, make sure you don't leave any lint from that in there. And then you can oil it and put it back in. I'm not going to pull, yeah I am, I'm going to pull this apart. While you've got it apart, you can look, and I'll even look sometimes with a magnifier. My eyesight's not so good as I get older. But you can look and see if the little screws have poked a hole through the cork, causing a click. And if so, you can change the cork. I'm going to cut one off. This is a fairly new horn, and these corks are in good shape. But I'm going to cut one off with a razor blade here. Clean it off as well as you can. Then go through and get rid of all your key clicks. I've shown this, the barge contact cement that I get from J.L. Smith and Company. I showed that when I do a Tenon cork. And you put it on both parts. I use the leather binding from a book. It's a very thin and hard leather. It's a bonded leather. It's actually got a little cardboard on the back, but that seems to hold up very well. And you put that on there and let it dry till it's not tacky before you put the parts together. You can blow on it a bit to help it to dry, and then it's a little bit of a waiting game. And if you're doing a bunch of them at once, then you're not waiting for each one. After that glue's dried a little bit, I'm going to cut a little piece off this bonded leather. You need a fairly sharp razor blade. Either buy them by the box of 100 and keep them handy, or you have to know how to sharpen them, which most oboe players are adept at sharpening things. That on there. And actually I cut that a little too short. I could redo that, and if it's too long you just trim the edge. I'm going to leave that and move on for this video. That'll do the job. Now I would have all this apart and put it back together, but I'm going to leave it like this for now. I copied a photo of an oboe on a piece of hardwood and glued it on there and drilled little holes where each of the rods would go. And so if you were taking an oboe completely apart, you could keep track of which rod goes, which screw goes where. I drilled these little holes off to the side for pivot screws if I were completely taking one apart, so I wouldn't mix things up. Most of the rod lengths are different enough and they only fit one spot. It's not going to be a life or death situation if you get them mixed up some. When oiling the rod, to put it back and I've already wiped this rod off. All you need, I put a little oil on the threads and a little oil here on the end, and when you put it together, that will spread out over the whole distance of the rod. This isn't going together so easily. The springs are kind of holding it from going where I want to. When you put the keys back on, it's best if you can hook the spring as you put the key on, if possible. It's not always possible to do that, because if you hook the spring after the fact, you're going to have to flex it a little bit beyond where it normally goes. This is a spring hook I got from Forest's Music. I like these. You'll have to hook the spring a little beyond where it goes to fit in there, and you might flex it and change the tension on the springs, which isn't the best thing to do. I got this screwdriver from Faree's Tools in Battle Creek, Michigan. You can get a little more torque with a longer screwdriver. If you're doing this every day, you don't want to be holding some little jeweler screwdriver all the time, unless you have very dainty hands. Just push that in a little too far. Again, I'm grabbing it against the screw slot in a way that won't, screwdriver slot, in a way that won't squeeze that slot closed. There, I'm getting the spring on as I put the key into position. These keys are fit pretty well. Yamaha does a good job of that, and that actually makes it a little harder to put back together. Things have to be lined up just right before they'll go. Now you might run into a problem with if you're disassembling this rod here, because of those tiny little screws that hold that key assembly together. Those are called key assembly screws. And I'll show you that. Yeah, these keys are really fit pretty well. There's not too much end play anywhere, and that makes it a little trickier to take apart and put back together. You could use oil. Technically, you should use probably some sort of a grease, a light grease on the pivot screws. Again, from Faree's Tools, I got this little screw holding screwdriver that has a set of spring-loaded tweezers on it, and that's how you can get these small screws out. Quite a bit of downward pressure, downward pressure in case it sticks so it doesn't slip out like it just did. Let's try that again. If they're really stuck bad, you might want to put a little oil and heat to them, so that because if you break the head off of one of these little screws, you can be in trouble. You might be able to see that that holds that screw well, and then make sure you don't accidentally spring it across the room. I like to keep extras of these screws. They're available for Fox and Luray oboes from Forest's Music, and that's how those little screws can go in and out. If you don't have one of these screwdrivers, you can poke this little screw through a piece of paper, and that paper can help you hold it into place to help you get started. Otherwise, these can be really frustrating. But that's how I do that. And that's disassembly and reassembling of an oboe then. While you have your oboe apart, if you're really brave about it, you might want to clean up the keys a bit. Well, it's kind of hard to do unless you're doing an overhaul. And when I'm doing a repat or an overhaul, I actually have an automatic key polishing machine. But you might be able to see the tarnish on this key. There's a product that J.L. Smith sells called Happich Semi-Chrome Polish, and that's the best stuff I've found. You might also find it in auto parts stores or at a jewelry supply place. I've got a mostly used up tube here, and this will get the stuff off. It has just enough abrasive in it that you can do that. This has a nice, fairly new leather pad on it for some reason on this old horn, and that polished that up quite nicely. Let's see if you can see the difference between those two sides on that. And then if you're doing the whole oboe, it's kind of hard to do the rim here, you might leave that or be very careful going around that. It's easy to get the tarnish all over your fingers and all over the pads and make a mess out of all your cork pads and skin pads. And of course you don't want to abrade or any way tear the skin pads. I've got a strip of cotton cloth. It's actually good if it's got a little polyester in it because it won't tear so easily. And I've tied one end to a little hook on my bench. And use this this polishing compound sparingly. And you can get into all the tight little corners and stuff in this manner. And again, being as careful as you can to avoid dirtying up the pads. And in that way you can get a nice polish to those keys. It takes about a half a day to take an oboe apart and do all this. You're bound to knock a key cork off here and there, so allow time for that. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to do an oboe like this. So if you're that energetic, you can do that yourself. Now I want to talk about stuck swabs. Many people use these silk swabs that can so easily get a little twist to them and get stuck, usually pretty far up. The last thing you want to do is pull hard trying to get it out. You're bound to just make it really tight and difficult. If it's stuck in here somewhere, you can pull those keys and take something, being careful not to do any damage to the tone hole rim especially. Sometimes you can kind of go through the tone hole and kind of push it down and get it loosened up that way. It's best not to ever get them stuck at all. You can have someone sew a string on the bottom end so that you've always got something sticking out the bottom that you can pull it out. You can be in the very good habit of always running it through the top in this fashion and always pull it down that way. But let's say you do have one stuck and you have to deal with it. A few tools that can help. I found an alligator forceps on eBay. It's got jaws on it and some teeth on it there. And sometimes you can reach in there and get it out that way. This one is, I forget what that is, about 8 inches long or so. They have longer ones, but they also tend to be a little wider diameter and they don't actually fit up as far in the oboe, so don't be tempted to buy too long of one. So that's been handy at times to get stuck swabs out. The usual method is to have a screw. This one's rather crudely done. A coarse wood screw silver soldered onto a metal rod, usually brass. This is a piece of steel drill rod. The problem with this, and this is what most music stores would use, is you can so easily scratch the bore if that doesn't go in straight. Or maybe you hit the swab that's all knotted up, it's kind of hard, it pushes the screw off into the bore while you're trying to screw it into the swab. So I consider these to be rather dangerous, and that's what most people use. One of my customers once used a crochet hook. I kind of made a crochet hook shape on that, a piece of drill rod. I tried to shape it in a way that it's not going to scratch the bore. That's a possibility. This is something I made up. Maybe you can get someone to make you one. Out of brass rod. If the brass is wide enough, and most people use about an 1/8 inch rod, which isn't safe. If it's wide enough here, then it can't move in the bore so much in a way that it can't tip that it would scratch the bore. I've also got a plastic sleeve that fits the bottom of the oboe, like so, to help hold it straight. So unless your oboe is affectionately nicknamed the banana bore, this should be perfectly safe to use and to turn into a swab. Snugly enough to pull it out. Very occasionally you'll get a swab stuck so well you just can't get it pulled out with a screw arrangement. Without it just kind of pulls out of the swab without the swab coming with it. And then you've got to cut the swab off here The reed well goes down about to where the second octave vent is. That's about how deep the reed well is. You've got to pick out or somehow cut out all that swab out of that reed well. I've used a little X-Acto knife cutter that I've bent. I've used tweezers that I've sharpened up and just pick all the threads out. It's going to take a good half hour, maybe 45 minutes. Get most of that swab out of there. The bore is less than 4 millimeters big up there. It's helpful to look down an oboe sometime and see just how small the bore is up there. And then you can use a nicely rounded piece of drill rod, smaller than the bore, very well centered. You've got most of the swab picked out of there. Tuck the rest down into the bore. Stick this in there and tap it with a small hammer. I've made up this little guide too to help keep it straight, and a couple of sharp raps, and that'll just keep it very well centered. With a rawhide mallet on here, we'll get the swab out. So those are some ways you can remove stuck swabs. Now we're going to change this tenon cork. First thing we need to do, it's a little bit loose on there. First thing we need to do is get it off of there. This scares some people, but the usual method is to use a pair of slip jaw pliers with teeth on it. And assuming it'll fit there, it just barely does in this case. We're going to put it on there. We're going to use enough downward pressure, squeezing pressure to kind of bite through the cork, but we're not going to do any damage to the tenon. Most of the pressure will be in a circular going around it motion to get the cork off. Seems to be on there pretty good. This one's on there real good. Usually that's about all it takes, and it's all off of there. The glues have gotten much better over the years. That didn't do it very well at all. Sometimes you just have to use a screwdriver and really pick at it. Okay, I've taken all that off, and I've also sanded it just a little bit with a strip of I use this, you find this in the sandpaper section of any hardware store. It's like a screen, like a plastic screen with abrasive grit on it. Next I need to kind of see how thick a cork I might want to put on there. So I'm looking in there, and it can be a little deceptive if there's a bevel on here. So look carefully there and see about what thickness of cork you want to replace that with. I think we're going to go with something like this. I'm going to find as nice a piece as I can. Cork can be very expensive, and usually you have to pretty much take the whole shipment or send the whole shipment back. You can't pick and choose. I'm running out of stuff as nice as I would like. We're going to use this here. Look for the best side. I'm doing this on a cutting board so I don't cut up my table. And I'm going to hold it up to the shoulder there and use a pen and mark how wide it needs to be. Then I'm going to take a steel rule get some of this stuff out of the way. Cut the cork. Instead of trying to get the cork to make what's called a butt joint, cut it exactly to length, we're going to cut a little bevel. I'm going to cut off that little, no, that's just